What is backward design? The concept of backward design was developed by Grant Wiggins and J. McTighe. In their book, Understanding by Design, Wiggins and McTighe describe what backward design is and how it can be applied. Essentially, backward design is a three-stage approach to curriculum, course, and program design that begins with the end in mind. In other words, the design approach starts with focusing on the understandings that we want students to come away with after engaging in the instructional process. After identifying the intended learning outcomes, thinking then shifts to figuring out how best to assess student learning with respect to those outcomes. The design approach concludes with figuring out the instructional path, the activities, the resources, the materials that will lead from the intended learning outcomes to the assessment of learning. When it comes down to it, backward design makes good educational sense. It is an approach to curriculum design that can be used no matter what format or modality you are working within. What this means is that backward design is not a concept that is unique to competency-based education. It is important to note, though, that backward design naturally fits with the philosophy behind competency-based education. Therefore, let's take a minute to translate in competency-based education terms the stages of the backward design process. The first stage of the backward design process is to identify and write the competencies that describe what students are to learn. It is critical that the knowledge, skills, and abilities that students must acquire are clearly defined and articulated. The competencies are the foundation for the entire design process. Therefore, taking the time to think through and carefully craft competency statements is essential. The backward design approach begins with developing the competencies because they represent the target that we are aiming for when guiding students through the learning process. Knowing where the target is helps to ensure that we create a learning path that effectively gets students from point A to point B. Once the competencies have been developed, the process shifts to the second stage, building assessments. In much the same way that it is important to know upfront what the intended learning is, it is equally essential to know how that learning will be assessed. Therefore, the assessments that correspond to the competencies are built in the second phase of the design process. Since both the competencies and the assessments dictate the endpoint for a particular instructional sequence, they should be developed prior to the instruction that will lead to that endpoint. Therefore, the third and final stage of the backward design process is curating the instructional resources. During this stage of the process, the learning activities, the formative assessments, and the content materials are gathered and/or created. It is important during this stage to choose the instructional resources in a purposeful manner that align to the competencies and assessments that have been developed. In other words, the instructional resources should naturally lead from the competency to the corresponding assessment. To summarize, backward design involves breaking down the design process into three steps: writing competencies, building assessments, and curating instructional resources. An important thing to note about the design process is that even though the steps are presented in a linear fashion, the process should always remain fluid. There may be times when you have to move between the stages as the design of the curriculum, course, or program evolves. As Wiggins and McTighe point out, the end goal is to have a coherent, aligned design that results in student understanding. One question that often comes up when talking about backward design deals with why the design process is referred to as backward. There are two reasons for this. First, the design process is backward in the sense that you are asked to start with the end in mind. The model requires you to first think about the end results that are desired. Then you work on the assessments that will measure those results. Finally, you pull together the instruction that you will follow to get to the end results. Second, this approach also feels foreign to educators because it is backward compared to how many of us typically approach the design process. Traditionally, many educators start with the activities or the materials. They then build the assessments based on the activities and content that were used. In the end, the hope is that the desired learning has occurred. Much like competency-based education flips the model when thinking about holding learning constant, backward design flips the approach to ensure that the intended learning is clearly articulated, appropriately assessed, and effectively worked toward. In Understanding by Design, Wiggins and McTighe state that the best designs derive backward from the learnings sought. In the context of competency-based education, the best designs start with the competencies. From those competencies, the assessments are built and the subsequent learning activities are developed. As noted earlier, the backward design approach to the development process makes logical sense. For most educators, it requires a shift in thinking, and it requires some practice. Ultimately, though, backwards design is an approach that, when applied with fidelity, can lead to high-quality curriculum, courses, and programs.